The election results came the morning after we all voted. The opposition's defeat was crushing. The communists emerged triumphant with more than 60% of the vote. My mother declared that the elections had been neither free nor fair. The entire campaign, she said, had been organized by the party. It was absurd to expect it to both regulate a competition between itself and other parties and try to win the election at the same time. The whole thing was a fraud. That turned out to be harsh, or at least harsh by the standards of the international community. Their official explanation was that the opposition parties had had little time to prepare and had struggled to field candidates in rural areas, and that since the old dissidents had been jailed and only recently released, it had been too late for them to run for office. The months that followed saw protests and unrest increase everywhere. In the north, unidentified shots during one of the many demonstrations killed 4 opposition activists. The transition to liberalism was now sealed with blood. Democracy had its martyrs. Freedom works, the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker told a crowd of more than 300,000 gathered in the Capitol in June 1991 to welcome the first state visit by an American official. Both his government and private American organizations would be involved to help get things right. They would help us construct, so they declared, democracy, markets, and a constitutional order. The new government did not last long. Pressure from the international community, increasing looting and violence on the streets, and deteriorating economic conditions forced the party to call new elections. Within a year, the country was again in campaign mode. This time, the forces advocating swift change had longer to prepare. One afternoon, Bashkim Spahia, a local doctor and former party member turned opposition candidate, knocked on our door, visibly agitated. He was wearing a charcoal grey jacket, cut in the style favoured by Leonid Brezhnev. Under it, he had on a purple T-shirt with pink writing across the middle. The writing was in English. It read, "Sweet dreams, my lovely friends." Bashkim asked if my father owned any grey socks he could borrow for a few months. He explained that for the election campaign, the U.S. State Department had distributed brochures containing important advice on what aspiring members of parliament ought to wear. Apparently, only dark socks are acceptable, grey or black, but better grey, he added, visibly distressed. I only have white socks. My parents invited him in for coffee. They tried to explain that the advice could not have come from the State Department. Perhaps it came from the U.S. Embassy. Even then, the embassy might be flexible. Bashkim shook his head. He was inconsolable. He would never be able to win his seat back from those dirty communist bastards without the right color socks. On the night his victory was announced, we spotted him in a television debate, wearing the thick grey woolen socks my grandmother had knitted for my father. My family was particularly proud to have contributed to Bashkim's victory. They bore no grudges. They were happy to overlook the fact that his wife, Vera, had once complained to the local council that my parents were reluctant to clean the street on Sundays. Nor did they hold it against Bashkim that he never returned my father's socks. Within a short period of time, our local doctor went on to become not only a charismatic politician, but also a highly successful businessman. He replaced the Brezhnev jacket with Hugo Boss. I bet he started wearing silk socks too. Everyone wants to leave, I wrote in my diary, commenting on the events of March and August 1991. Everyone except us. Most of our friends and relatives spent weeks, even months, planning how they would leave. There was a wide range of possibilities. Falsifying documents, hijacking boats, crossing the land border, applying for a visa, borrowing money. People hardly gave thought to the purpose. Knowing how you would get somewhere was more important than knowing why. In the past, one would have been arrested for wanting to leave. Now that nobody was stopping us from emigrating, we were no longer welcome on the other side. Our exiles used to be received as heroes. Now they were treated like criminals. My father lost his job shortly after the first multi-party elections. He returned home one afternoon and announced that his office would close for good in a few weeks. Trained as a forest engineer, he had devoted the first half of his life to planting and looking after new trees. Now, the state had other priorities. Not only were new trees no longer planted, the existing ones were being chopped down. Power cuts and heating demands on the one hand, and the brand new cultivation of free initiative on the other, meant that every night more trees disappeared from the forests. Some might have called it theft, but I think bottom-up privatization would be a better description. Everyone seemed relaxed about this news of the redundancy. They reacted as if there were dozens of much more desirable jobs lined up, like homemade biscuits cooking in the oven. My mother didn't technically lose her job. She was offered early retirement at the age of 46, and she accepted it. To mark the occasion, my father, who had just received his last salary, bought Amstel beers from a newly opened mini-market. It was a perfectly pleasant family evening, until my mother made an announcement concerning how she was planning to keep herself occupied during retirement. She declared that she had joined the opposition party on the day it was founded. Nini and I froze. My father looked up from his plate with bewildered surprise, which I knew would soon turn into a full-blown explosion of rage. It was the look he gave my mother when she made important decisions without consulting him. What started with those bewildered looks turned into an inquisitive interrogation, reprimands, fury, mutual aggression, and after that, silence. A silence that could go on for weeks. My parents argued all the time, but they almost always argued as equals. When my mother made decisions without asking my father, the symmetry broke down, and my father felt hurt. My parents had built their relationship on heckling, and as the years went by, the boundary between the playful and the bitter exchanges became increasingly blurred. When my mother made her announcement, my father gave her the bewildered look I was familiar with. But he did not stand up. He did not shout. He continued to stare at her incredulously. My mother noticed. She must have felt sorry somehow, compelled to explain. She said everything was still controlled by spies. There were former communists everywhere, both in the government and in the opposition. People with biographies, family histories like theirs, had to be involved. Someone had to find the courage. Otherwise, things would never change. We would always be represented by the same people. My father listened quietly. He kept his rage locked inside him. When I thought about this episode later, it dawned on me that perhaps he had cared about losing his job more than he'd let on. Perhaps, in his mind, there was a significant difference between being made redundant and taking early retirements. Perhaps, now that he was dependent on the pensions of 2 women, he felt like less of a man. He could no longer do what other men did, shout, threaten, shake with rage, and throw crockery at the wall. My mother did not stop working when she retired. She entered one of the busiest periods of her life. Shortly after joining the Democratic Party, she became one of the leaders of its National Women's Association. She attended party meetings, selected candidates for elections, organized rallies, ran reform campaigns, joined national committees, met foreign delegations. The time that was left, she spent in the archives and in court, pursuing the restitution of family properties that had been confiscated in the past. "You should stay at home a bit more. Look after the children," Nini said to her. "I'm fine," I usually replied, delighted that the once-per-term check on my maths had now slipped from my mother's agenda. "Mummy, you should get a driving license," I suggested as an alternative. "We don't need a driving license," my father intervened, worrying that if he didn't oppose the prospect right away, his ongoing unemployment might promote him to family chauffeur. "It's not good for the environment." My mother never prepared her speeches. She gave hundreds of them. As I was entering my teens, I was more likely to see her on the platform of a political rally, waiting for her turn to speak, than to meet her at home for dinner. She stood erect, high up on the stage, and spoke to tens of thousands of people, pausing frequently and modulating her voice as circumstances dictated, sometimes forcing the audience into a terrifying silence, sometimes rousing the crowds to roaring applause. She always spoke without notes. She delivered her speeches as if she had written them in her head many years ago, as if she had rehearsed every day of her life the sentences that she would later utter. But her words didn't come across as if they had migrated from the past. They were new, if a little foreign-sounding. Individual initiative, transition, liberalization, shock therapy, sacrifice, property, contract, Western democracy. Except for the word freedom. That one was old. But she pronounced it differently, always with an exclamation mark at the end. Then it sounded new. When my mother was not in political meetings, she was either rummaging through the city archives to find her family's belongings, or she was in court, trying to recover ownership titles, leading her siblings' fight to reclaim the thousands of square miles of land, hundreds of flats and dozens of factories that had once belonged to their grandfather, a woodchopper turned millionaire shortly before the end of the war. My father and grandmother never took any interest, partly because they did not think the properties could be recovered, and partly because they doubted that they should be. Such a waste of time, my grandmother would occasionally comment, shaking her head. It was often ambiguous whether she meant that politics was a waste of time, or the search for my mother's famed properties, or both. My mother, on the other hand, would never let go. Unlike my father, who thought that people were naturally good, she thought they were naturally evil. That's why she was convinced that socialism could never work, even under the best circumstances. It was against human nature. People needed to know what belonged to them, and to be able to do with it what they wanted. Then they would look after their assets, and there wouldn't be fighting anymore. It would be healthy competition. She believed that if only one could discover the truth about who was the first owner of anything, all the interactions that followed could be regulated, so that not only our family, but everyone else too, would have the opportunity to become as rich as her ancestors had once been. I was 14 when my father was hired to manage a state company which exported medicinal plants. His success in reducing its huge debts meant he was later promoted to general director of the largest port in the country. A phone line was installed at home, and a driver would now take him to work each day. My brother Lani and I were impressed, but my father became troubled. "Do you know what the hardest thing I've done in my life is?" he asked one November morning before work. He stood in front of the closed curtains in our living room, stirring his coffee. I tried to guess, but each time he shook his head. "Wait, remember when I was desperate to have a photo of Enver Hoxha on the bookshelf? You told me we needed a nice frame for it, and we had to wait until it would be ready." I chuckled. 5 years after the fall of socialism, episodes of our life back then had become part of the repertoire of amusing family anecdotes. We would joke about them over meals, like drunken sailors who had survived a shipwreck and relished showing one another the scars. But my father was not in his usual playful mood. "It is this," he said, slowly moving the curtain to reveal a group of 20 or 30 Roma gathered in the garden. Some of the women had toddlers tied to their backs. Others nursed babies while sitting on the ground. More were crowded outside the gate. A sudden movement spread in the courtyard. "There he is! He's going to come out!" My father closed the curtain. He sat on the sofa and reached out for his asthma pump, taking a few deep breaths. "They work in a port," he said after a pause. Do you know what we call them? Structural reforms. His face was twisted by an expression of pain. Like every other state enterprise, the port had been urged to cut costs and implement what the World Bank called structural reforms. Hundreds of Roma worked at the port. Cargo loaders, cleaners, warehouse operatives. My father was responsible for firing them all. They stood in the courtyard until he appeared at the door. Then, "You're a good man, boss. Don't do it. Don't listen to them thieves." "Is it about drinking, boss? Is it that? I can quit drinking tomorrow. I can quit smoking too if you want. I only have a couple of years until retirement, boss. I've worked in the port since I was 13. "I don't know how to go out there," my father said. "Every day there are more people." He promised his bosses he would do it, but never did. He never signed off on the redundancies. At first, it was going to be my mother who would run to become an MP in 1996. She had been a member of the opposition party since the day it was founded. She was possessed with the zeal of the prophet, and although her speeches enthused in the short term, in the long run they frightened people. She volunteered my father to take her place. "He's a man, that helps," she explained while pitching him. "And he is loved as if he were a woman. That helps too." My father got more than 60% of the vote, the only success he recorded in his short career as an MP. After the United Nations suspended sanctions on the former Yugoslavia in 1995, there were fewer opportunities for smuggling and more people sitting on cash, which meant that the pyramid schemes, which had started to emerge in the early 90s to compensate for Albania's underdeveloped financial sector, could promise increasingly high interest rates in return for deposits. A few months later, these pyramid schemes all became insolvent. More than half of the population, including my family, lost their savings. People accused the government of colluding with the owners of the companies and took to the streets. Looting, assaults on military garrisons, and an unprecedented wave of emigration followed. More than 2,000 people lost their lives. These events are recorded in the history books as the Albanian Civil War. For us, it is enough to mention the year 1997. How does one write about civil war? This is from my diary of the time. The 13th of March. I can't see through my tears. I'm in my bedroom. The only thing I hear apart from my own sobbing is the thundering of machine guns. I found Nini shaking. She said Babi is stuck in Parliament and the Parliament is in flames. The phone line is broken. Mommy is at the beach with Lani. They went there this morning before things got out of control. They still haven't come back. I started to cry. Then I opened my mouth, but no sound would come out. The 14th of March, 9:50 a.m. Mommy and Lani left for Italy yesterday. A man came to tell us. They were at the beach and saw a boat stop at the pier, and they jumped on it. I don't know if they've made it. They haven't called. The phone started working again, but nobody's called. The roads are blocked, but I think the television would report if someone died in Parliament. So I guess Babi is okay. I still can't talk, though. Babi made it back from Tirana. He said the port had been completely destroyed. Nini said to move my bed away from the window. We get lots of Kalashnikov bullets falling on the windowsill. Mommy called for the first time. They're in a refugee camp in Bari, in the south of Italy. Babi is angry with her. He says she shouldn't have left without asking. Nini spoke to her, then passed the phone to Babi, and he just passed the phone to me, but I couldn't say anything. Mommy said she just saw the boat and went on it. She was trying to save Lani. Nini said you don't take one child and leave the other. Babi swears he's never going to talk to her again. The 19th of March. I talked to Mommy on the phone today. She found a job in Rome, looking after some elderly woman who is paralyzed. Mommy says she will apply for political asylum. They give her food and lodging and 500,000 lire, and she can keep Lani with her. Babi still won't talk to her. The 25th of March. I don't think the school will reopen this year. I have no idea what will happen to my final exams. In fact, the schools remained closed until late June 1997, when they opened for a few days to enable final year students like me to take their exams. In school, we were informed that anything we did during the exams was unlikely to make a difference. Final marks would most likely be assigned to match one's predicted grades. The future looked bleak. I had to choose my topic of study at university. I found it hard to imagine myself in one kind of life rather than another. All I had were doubts. But the doubts helped me decide. I announced the outcome of the decision over dinner with my father and grandmother. My father was alarmed. Philosophy? Do you know what Marx said? He said that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Not many truths came out of Marx, but that may well have been one. I've never heard that sentence before, I replied. And anyway, you can change the world by studying philosophy. Philosophy is not a profession, he exclaimed. How am I going to ask people to lend me money for her to study? To study what? Philosophy? That night, we made a pact. They promised to let me study philosophy, and I promised to stay away from Marx. I waved goodbye to my father and my grandmother on the shore, and travelled to Italy on a boat. I never lived there again. Each year, I begin my Marx courses at the London School of Economics by telling students that many people think of socialism as a theory of class struggle or economic justice, but that in reality, something more fundamental animates it. Socialism, I tell them, is above all a theory of human freedom. Freedom is not sacrificed only when others tell us what to say, how to behave. A society that claims to enable people to realize their potential, but fails to change the structures that prevent everyone from flourishing, is also oppressive. And yet, despite all the constraints, we never lose our inner freedom. The freedom to do what is right. My father and my grandmother did not live to see what became of my studies. After quitting his career as an MP, my father was thrust from one private employer to another, each time blaming the dismissal on his poor English and, increasingly, his rudimentary computer skills. To facilitate his job searches, the family moved to the capital, now one of the most polluted areas in the country. His asthma deteriorated. One summer evening, shortly after his 60th birthday, he had a violent asthma attack. He rushed to the window and opened it to breathe, but was wrapped in a cloud of carbon monoxide and dust. The ambulance found him dead. My mother was in Italy when it happened. My parents had reconciled, but she worked there seasonally as a carer or cleaner to help offset some of our new debts, while her siblings in Albania chased their old confiscated properties. Those efforts came to fruition a few months after my grandmother's death, following that of my father. A large chunk of coastal land was sold to an Arab property developer, and our fortunes changed overnight. I no longer needed to count my last pennies until the next scholarship installment. I could enjoy meals out and drink late in bars discussing politics with my new university friends. Many of those friends were self-declared socialists. Western socialists, that is. They spoke about Rosa Luxemburg, Salvador Allende, or Ernesto Che Guevara as secular saints. They did not think that my stories from the 80s about socialism in Albania were in any way significant to their political beliefs. What you had was not really socialism, they would say, barely concealing their irritation. Their socialism would be brought about by the right people, with the right motives, under the right circumstances. There was only one thing to do about mine. Forget it. My mother finds it difficult to understand why I teach and research Marx. Mostly, she keeps her criticisms to herself. Only once did she draw attention to a cousin's remarks, that my grandfather did not spend 15 years locked up in prison so that I would leave Albania to defend socialism. We laughed awkwardly, then changed the topic. It left me feeling like someone who is involved in murder, as if the mere association with the ideas of a system that destroys so many lives in my family were enough to make me the person responsible for pulling the trigger. Deep down, I knew this was what she thought. I always wanted to clarify, but didn't know where to start. I thought that it would take a book to answer. This is that book.